Just before midnight, on a snow-covered airfield at Goose Bay, Labrador, 9 Americans prepare for the more than 3,000-kilometer flight to Europe in the final months of World War II. Like Gander, Goose Bay has become a vital strategic base for overseas ferrying operations. Piloting the massive B-24 bomber is 26-year-old Lieutenant Roger J. Mellion of Bradford, New Jersey. This is no ordinary ferry flight. This is a recently trained, full combat replacement crew. It's been a busy day at the airbase, and already several aircraft have left safely for Europe. As the bomber lines up on the runway, the 9-man crew secure their positions for takeoff. This aircraft is loaded with fuel and wartime supplies. As Captain Mellion powers up the 4 massive engines, there is no indication of the disaster that lies ahead.
So Captain Mellion's aircraft was one of a number of B-24 Liberator heavy bombers to leave that night from Goose Bay for the UK. And it was just 3 minutes into the flight that the aircraft crashed onto frozen Lake Melville. So the American Search and Rescue Unit at Goose was on standby that night when word came that someone had spotted what looked to be a light or a flare east of the airfield. So the Search and Rescue Unit set out to investigate. Now this unit was under the direction of a man by the name of Willie Knutson, and he was a veteran Arctic explorer and now an Air Force captain and search and rescue officer. So Knutson gathered up his men and equipment and left Goose Bay using 2 snowmobiles, 2 dog sled teams, and headed out over Lake Melville. And going was tough. They had to cross the ice and over heavy snow drifts. And of course it was dark and it was snowing and blowing constantly. And after about a half an hour, the search team stopped, turned out the lights on their snowmobiles to get a better view of the area, and I guess to let their eyes adjust in the darkness. And at this point, snow was coming down heavily, but they could see something glowing in the distance. So they headed in that direction, and within about 10 minutes, they had reached the crash site.
The wreckage of the shattered plane lay strewn over a wide area on the frozen lake. The hope for survivors was nil.
First thing that the search crew did was to make a very quick assessment of the scene for safety reasons, checking, say for example, for thin ice and burning gasoline, and again in heavy snow and high winds. So the men began searching the scene, starting first near the burning sections, and they quickly found one crew member who turned out to be, unfortunately, deceased. And seconds later, discovered another crew member. However, this man, an air gunner by the name of Wayne Robinette, he showed signs of life, although he was in very serious condition. So they wrapped him in blankets, placed him aboard a trailer, pulled by one of the snow machines, and they rushed him back to a hospital at Goose Bay. And the rest of the crew had, unfortunately, perished in the crash. Now back at Goose, attention turned to saving Robinette's life. And the extent of effort by hospital staff at Goose in doing so was quite extraordinary. His injuries were extremely serious, and initially at least he was given no chance of survival. And when he first arrived at hospital, he was diagnosed as suffering from shock and frostbite, possible internal injuries, and severe head injuries.
The station hospital report would record, and I quote, "After the initial shock treatment had been administered, it was found that the head injury was a depressed skull fracture. As soon as the seriousness of this wound was realized, a radiogram was sent to the commanding general's office at Manchester, requesting that brain surgeons be sent immediately.
And in fact, it was the first time that the hospital at Goose Bay had requested aid in an emergency.
In addition to the severe head wound, Robinette was suffering from extreme frostbite. In fact, when he was brought into the hospital, his hands were completely encased in blocks of ice, and it had to be chipped away before any thawing could be attempted.
Within hours, a noted brain surgeon, Captain William Scoville, arrived from the U.S. at Goose Bay by air. As for Robinette, his clothing had to be cut from his body, and he was administered plasma to counteract the effects of shock. And only then could Captain Scoville operate on the airman. And it was a delicate procedure, as you can imagine, one that took more than 5 hours.
Robinette would come through his surgery, and although he did not regain consciousness, he was, for the time being, stable.
And over the next few days, calls went out for blood donors at the base, and base personnel came through. Oxygen was administered to Robinette day and night using a face mask, and he received 24-hour care by the doctors, nurses, and attendants.
Just 3 days after his successful brain surgery, on the 17th of January, Robinette's temperature begins to soar. It goes to 106 degrees. All efforts to lower his surging temperature were failing. A decision needed to be made, and it needed to be made fast. The doctors decided to shut off all the heat in his room and have the staff open all the windows, exposing the flyer to the frigid Labrador winter. With the room temperature set to near 0 degrees, the staff would have to don extra wool socks, coats, and gloves to continue their aid to Robinette. Despite being given oxygen from an air mask, it was noted that a thick mucus was beginning to build up in the flyer's throat. This was restricting his airway. This was also a clear indication of infection, most likely from toxic exposure from the frostbitten hands and feet. Nurses and staff were forced to remove the oxygen face mask every 5 minutes to clear mucus from the flyer's throat, and it was noted that it was spreading. It was now in one of his lungs and getting worse. Robinette was now in a desperate battle with a severe infection. On the morning of the 19th, with Robinette fighting for his life, a decision was made to remove the oxygen face mask and place the patient in a full oxygen tent. This would allow the staff to clear his airway faster, as they would not have to strap and unstrap the face mask. However, as Robinette was being moved into the oxygen tent, he stopped breathing. He then lapsed into cardiac arrest. All efforts to resuscitate were in vain, and he was pronounced dead at 8:25 GMT on January 19, 1945, at the base hospital in Goose Bay, Labrador. On the cold gray morning of January 24th, at the Joint Canadian-United States Cemetery, the body of Corporal Wayne Robinette was laid to rest alongside his comrades who had died in the crash just a week earlier. They had lived together and trained together, but like so many other air crews in World War II, their chance to serve had been tragically cut short by an accident. Their role in history was at an end. Or so it seemed.
My name is Dave Padden, and I'm originally from Northwest River, Labrador, which is about 20 miles away from the big air base in Goose Bay.
By the summer of 1945, war in Europe had ended, and life in and around Goose Bay and up and down the Labrador coast was beginning to return to normal.
My grandfather, he was a doctor who traveled all over the coast of Labrador by dog team for many, many years, about 27 years, and eventually succumbed to a simple infection in 1939 on Christmas Eve. He was worn out by these long dog team trips. And he had a peritonitis. There was no antibiotics available in those days, and he died fairly quickly. My father, Tony Padden, was in med school at the time. He finished and got his medical diploma about 1941. Joined the Navy. He was on North Atlantic convoys. He was on a minesweeper for the D-Day landings. And he was on a frigate which was torpedoed in the English Channel in March 1945. That was the end of the war for him. He came back home to Labrador and took over running the little hospital there that had been started by his grandparents. Grandmother was a nurse. And grandmother, of course, was quite glad to see him return from the war safe and sound. And he immediately set to work as the chief of Northern Medical Services for Labrador. Things were very difficult after the war. TB was a big scourge, and there was nutritional diseases and a lot of other problems. Of course, there was no antibiotics available to treat anybody. They were fairly new development and unavailable to a charitable organization like the Grenfell Mission. So one day, Dad was walking home from the hospital to our house near Northwest River's nice sandy beach. He was mulling over the various problems he had to deal with for health care in Labrador. And all of a sudden, a little boy, a local boy, came running up to him with something clutched in his hand and said, "Doctor, what's this?" So my father bent over and took a look at this. This doctor in his white coat, leaning over, looking at what this little boy was holding up. And getting, I suppose, the biggest surprise of his life, if you don't include being torpedoed in the middle of the night a few months prior. My father said to this little boy, "Where did you find that?" "On the beach, doctor. There's all kinds of them coming in on the tide." I guess my father was still incredulous, and I can just imagine him running down to Northwest River's beautiful sandy beach with this little boy trailing along behind. To find, laid out on the beach here and there all over the place, dozens and then eventually some hundreds of these little vials, because this is what the boy had been holding, a little glass vial with waxy substance in one end. What these vials were individual doses of penicillin, antibiotics. He said to this little boy, he said, "Go and find all of your friends, bring them here, pick up as many as you can. I'll give you 2 cents for each," which was good money in those days, "and take them up to the hospital, give them to the nurse." And with that, he started collecting as many as he could himself and stuffing them in all his pockets. And then all these kids showed up and started, harvesting them, picking up as many as they could. They were coming in everywhere, these little vials, all around the head of Lake Melville, on islands and beaches. And I talked to a number of the older people from Northwest River, people I grew up with. Dick Budgell, remembered picking some up. And I talked to Jean Crane, who's still around, living in Goose Bay. She's 95, and she was one of the kids who helped pick up these vials.
We were living right in the middle of the beach, looking out across the bay. Was playing on the beach enough, we saw these little vials, size of your finger. And when anything washed up, we'd examine it. So we took it across to the doctor, and he said it was penicillin.
A prize was instituted, $50, which was a huge sum in those days, to whoever could bring in the most. And that's an indication of how valuable this stuff was. These were extremely rare, and at one point my father wrote that he stood up and looked at one and thought, if I'd have had you 5 or 6 years ago, I probably could have saved my own father's life. Because, of course, they weren't available to my grandfather. And that was quite a realization, I would imagine. So eventually 300 to 400 of these little vials of penicillin were collected, and they all got used. My father kept them all on ice. They'd expired, they'd passed their expiry date, but they were still extremely effective because this was well before the days of antibiotic resistance through overuse. And they worked miraculously. They used to call it the miracle drug, I think. And my mother told me stories of giving injections to wounded servicemen in London when she was a nurse during the war, and watching sailors and soldiers and airmen with terrible wounds sort of recovering as you were watching them. One of the first people to get a dose in Labrador was a little girl named Stephanie Peacock who had pneumonia.
The story is, as my mother said, told me, that I had walked into the sea with all my clothes on, and subsequent to that developed pneumonia, and it was kind of touch and go, and Dr. Padden happened to be in the vicinity and had these vials of penicillin, and Mom said, he said, I'm not sure what dosage, but he said, give it a try and see how she does. It was kind of a last-ditch effort, right? And within hours, I was looking for food.
Well, every January 13th, I stop and think a little bit about Captain Melian and his crew who perished in that terrible crash. What was passed down to me was that the antibiotics came from Captain Melian's B-24 Liberator.
It was common practice for wartime overseas flights to carry supplies as needed, and for a war-ravaged Europe, penicillin would have been high on the list. While no official document of cargo was listed, Captain Melian's plane was the only one lost on Lake Melville that winter. From the crew of a lost B-24 Liberator came a true liberation for the people of Labrador, a liberation from illness, suffering, and death. This story is dedicated to the crew of that lost B-24 bomber. Pilot Roger Melian. Co-pilot Albert Pfeiffer. Navigator Frank Headland. Engineer Jack Cohnfelder. Radio operator John Corrigan. Gunners Waldo Robinson, Joseph Wistock, Robert Mallon, and Wayne Robinette. And to the dedicated Labrador doctor who truly did receive a gift from above.
Produced and narrated by David Hebard. Written by Dave Padden, Daryl Hillier, and David Hebard. Research, Daryl Hillier and Dave Padden. Special thanks to Stephanie Smith and Jean Crane. Additional source information: Army Air Force's Report of Major Accident 44-4958, January 13, 1945. 1383rd Army Air Force's Base Unit History, Goose Bay, Labrador,